and welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and for this episode I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Amanda Lee Falkenberg. Amanda's latest album is the Moons Symphony, and what you're listening to now is the first movement, Celestial Tug of War. I'm very much looking forward to my conversation with Amanda, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you for joining me for my podcast for Harmonious World. I'm very grateful.
It's my honor. Thank you for having me and the My Moons on your show.
Yeah, so talk to me about the Moons Symphony, because it's an absolutely stunning piece of music. And of course, you recorded it with the LSO and London Voices. So how did it all happen?
Well, I say this a lot because 5 years down the road after the conception, it could appear to someone who's been introduced to this project, relatively later in the piece. You might have thought I'd sat there with butcher paper and figured out the plan, and NASA scientists and astronauts and, and all the science and absolutely didn't start like any of that. It was just simply seeing more moons. I was in the middle of a piano concerto, also inspired by our moon, called Crossing of the Crescent Moon, and I was almost finished, and I just thought it's an abstract work for obviously piano and orchestra. And I thought, I'm just going to do a little bit of research on crescent moons to see if there's, something I can just sort of just enjoy thinking about in the last 2 minutes I had left of composing this score, and looking at ancient symbolism and its relevance. And 2 hours into my research, I stumbled across an article that said 10 of the weirdest moons of our solar system. And it just took my breath away. I thought, oh my goodness, there's more moons I could be writing for. And it was literally like a lightning bolt that went through my system. I was just looking at these moons, and I instantly felt like I was sort of like defending them, because they weren't weird to me at all. They were absolutely wonderful. And the first thing, like instantly, that came to me was these moons need music and these moons need emotion. And that was it. And then I set about my project, and then I thought, gosh, I've got to figure out how many moons. I was going to write 10. And I said to my husband, well, that's a bit too much. Let's settle on maybe 6 or something. So, and then I shortlisted the moons, and that's really how the project began.
Wow. And why record it with the LSO? I mean, why not? But
well, dream big or go home. And obviously they're one of the most incredible orchestras walking the planet, and having the dream team of that orchestra with Marin Alsop. And it was actually going to be in Abbey Road Studios as well, but because COVID restrictions were still around, we couldn't get the 60 voice choir and the orchestra in that one room. That's okay. We found a way around it, which I think is yielded a better recording anyway, because we've got separation. Good on Mario de Sa. He's been on this journey like for 5 years with me. I was sharing with him the vision way back when, and trying to align the diaries of Marin Alsop and LSO is obviously no easy feat. But so we were just having, in conversation for 5 years about how we were going to get all of this to happen simultaneously. And that's LSO story in it. There's more to all of that. Obviously, there's a big COVID story there as well, which is another whole chapter in this conversation if we need to go there. But yes, so the dream team.
Yes. So talk me through the various movements of the suite of the symphony, because they're all very different. They all have a very different texture and a very different momentum, if you like.
And hearing you say that is just, it really brings so much joy creatively to my heart and head, hearing that, because that, it's so easy to get samey when you're looking at some of the characteristics of these moons. And I poured a lot of mindful intention when I was doing my casting call on these moons, I guess you could say. I was really mindful about looking at their distinct worlds and making sure that creatively, musically, I could separate their stories in a very creative way to give them their own, personality, if you like. So I'm really pleased to hear you say that. And yeah, so it was definitely, first and foremost, when I shortlisted and start off with 6, it was based on aesthetics. It was based on literally the terrains, the colors, the moonscapes, really. That's all I had to really sort of guide my initial decisions about what I wanted to hang my hat on creatively and musically. And once I'd settled on those 6 moons, I then elected the first one that I would start to compose, and it's actually Europa. It's not Io that most people might think. It was actually Europa, because there was probably the most about that moon that was trending, because of course NASA is sending a spacecraft, big flagship spacecraft in 2024 to investigate this world. And so that sort of was material that was coming up in my research that I just felt, okay, I'm just going to start with this moon, because there seems to be a lot of things that I could get going on here. But I quickly realized in the research process that, whoa, there's a fair bit of science going on too. So rather than just focus on aesthetics, which I was only going to have a choir and maybe just a wordless boy choir, an orchestra and a wordless boy choir. Initially, I was just going to go after that vibe. But then when I started seeing the science that was embedded in these worlds and what these space probes had been able to collect, I just thought, oh my gosh, there is an opportunity that I cannot ignore here. And I thought, gosh, if I got a choir to sing the science, it's going to give it far more relevance. It's going to give it so much more outreach, because there's words there that, audience don't have to second guess the programmatic elements. It's being sung by libretto. And obviously that compounded my job as an artist, but I'm like, you do what you need to do, basically. And so, and I got quite excited about the fact that, there was another dimension that I could truly add to this project. And I'm a teacher at heart. So of course I'm always looking at angles of cross-collaborating and, joining as many multi-dimensions as possible. I just think that's just thrilling experience for anyone, any concert goer. You look at the ballet world of music and costumes and scenery and libretto, and it's just a gorgeous immersive experience. And I thought, gosh, I would love to try and replicate that in this project that I'm trying to formulate here. And that's when I came across some of the inconsistencies with my research, and it was obviously starting to bother me being a teacher. And I'm like, well, who do I believe here? And I turned to my husband. I'm like, right, I need to consult a moon specialist. It wasn't a scientist, it was just a moon specialist. And so there was a particular person that I kept coming across, and it was almost like a character. He'd be dressed up in like Eskimo gear and talking to people about this moon Europa. And I'm like, I really like the vibe of this person. And so I went and researched where he was from. And I'm like, oh gosh, he's at NASA. He's at NASA JPL. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to email him and see if he would be able to have a few moments with me, just talking about, what is actual fact, what's going on here with this world and this moon. And so I sent off this email to him, not thinking at all he would respond, because these people are obviously super busy. And it was one of these emails that you just type into and you're never sure they're going to actually receive it or not. But 7 days later, he contacted me to say my project sounded really interesting and be happy to Skype. And so, yes, I had a lovely, lively conversation. He was talking about magnetometers and SLS launches, and I was talking about pizzicato and strings and harps. And so it was really interesting. And I remember him saying to me towards the end of that that conversation, he said, Amanda, I think the scientists would be really interested in what you're doing. I said, really? And he said, oh, yes, they would be. And then one thing led to another, and I got introduced to the likes of Linda Spilko, who's lead scientist for Cassini mission, and so forth. So that's how the science element sort of infiltrated this project, if you like, which is a big piece when you look back on the libretto and the huge amount of research that I applied before the music component.
Yes, and that link between science and music has always been fascinating to those of us on either side and those in the middle, because there's a lot about music that you can't explain, and there's a lot about it that is physics and all the rest of it, and it's just a fascinating area, isn't it, that place where music and science meet. It's just fascinating.
It absolutely is. And to my point, the reason why I'm here in London is because we just had 2 massive events at Imperial College of London for Key Stage 3 students and Key Stage 5 students at Imperial College, Great Hall. And it was a pilot. It was like a launching of my outreach series called Luna, Learning Under New Artistic Regimes. And so I'm developing this program to cross-pollinate these 2 worlds. And I think the thing that I'm excited about is how music, the role that music can play, not just from an emotional perspective and a sound world, but what I'm finding is that now the libretto, and at least introducing how at least I presented it to the audience last Friday, was on because obviously science has driven the whole creative process. But I felt what happened at the end of that evening when we had the Q&A, the questions that came up from the students, the platform that this Moons Symphony now represents is like a stimulation ground for conversation. And I think that's just one dimension that could be explored in terms of having it firmly sitting on center stage with science to then, activate their minds, their curiosities and imaginations. And then, yes, I mean, the libretto's there sort of finessed in a way that I wanted to put a theatrical lens on how I was transferring the science back into the symphony, because obviously, you want it to have a poetic spin. You don't want it to be too, sciencey. But that's where this outreach program, Luna, comes into the picture, because now what we do is we look at a word and, like lifting the bonnet of a car, underneath there's all this nitty-gritty science that can come through.
That is amazing. It sounds absolutely fabulous. One of the things that I love about music is the use of music from centuries ago for storytelling, because using music, in folk songs and that sort of thing, it made the story easier to tell and easier to hear and easier to remember and all the rest of it. And I think that link between music, science, and then the language, the libretto, is really, really interesting.
And I think, being an educator, being a piano teacher, I mean, I have the luxury of just having, decades. I've been piano teaching since I was 13 years old. And I've had decades of just being in, direct conversations, one-on-one. Like, how unique is that? To really explore the minds of these all ages, from 2 years old to adults and 70-year-olds. And so I've had like an audience to kind of really enjoy, figuring how the mind operates, especially in the creative world of music, and learning as well, the theoretical world, because let's face it, that there is such a mathematics driven behind the notationary world of music. It's one thing to play and perform, but then you need to learn the language, just like you need to learn the formulas in physics and chemistry. And there's all of that beautiful cognitive area of neuroscience that it would be just extraordinary to explore. So you've got all these like multiple layers and dimensions of educational inspiration to intertwine together. And I think that's what I was really excited about, that here I could, maybe stand as close as I could to that science world and get that science world as close to that artistic world. And, boy, the from what I've experienced with the scientists that I've presented to over the years, and now, of course, I'm now just starting to reach the students, it's pretty exciting. The feedback I'm getting from the scientists is they really are, you're seeing their whole creative side being ignited by this theatrical platform. And, having them under lights and, camera and action on Friday, it was funny because I do a lot of piano recitals over the years, and I'm very fussy about how that comes together. I do want it to be quite a theatrical experience for my students. We have rehearsals and, we practice our bows and all that kind of theatre I inject into that experience. And here I was at Imperial College, and I said to one of my piano students that came, I said, well, it's basically like those piano recitals I set up for you many moons ago, but this time I get to work with the scientists and the astronauts, and I get to tell them what to do on stage.
Yeah.
But they were really good sports about it, actually. And they, this is the first time they were sort of positioned in this lens, if you like. And I wasn't sure how they would sort of respond and react to the and interact with this idea of, but they were really great sports, and I think they really enjoyed it. They got completely mobbed on stage with questions after, and I think they enjoyed the celebrity sort of aspect to all of that. The actors on stage, the scientists on stage, the moons, and it was a really joyful experience.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And to get scientists performing is wonderful, because there's so much about their world that is behind a screen and looking at data and all of that sort of stuff, and to be able to then come out onto a stage and talk about it, present it, is just wonderful.
And I think this is why, now I'm remembering, I did not set out with this vision. It was just Moons Need Music and Emotion. But I think this is probably where my role as a film composer really kicked in a whole other gear, when I was finessing these moons into stories. But I was not only looking at the characteristics of the moons and their particular science, what I also have injected into this music. In fact, I'm giving a presentation at Imperial College tomorrow night for another outreach for public audience, for outreach adults, is the fact that the actual scientists have also played a big role in the musical inspiration. When those geysers were finally discovered at Moon Enceladus, it was quite a sort of a detective story that was unfolding from the magnetometer instrument right up until the image team finally captured the geysers emanating tens of thousands of kilometers into the night sky, backlit by the sun. Those absolutely incredible imagery. I've created in the score, I call it the jaw-dropping chord, with that moment that the scientists, can you imagine, like, the career-defining moment water found in our outer solar system?
This seems an ideal opportunity to play a little of Enceladus, Rows and Rows of Gigantic Geysers, which is the fourth movement of the Moons Symphony.
So the emotion from the scientists that I've picked up on in my own research has also equally shown up in this symphony, not just necessarily the science of the moods.
There's so much going on. It's like, literally mind blown, really. And because now you're talking about art and photography as well.
Yeah.
Because it's that how we see things is just amazing. And there have been some beautiful images of these moons and of everything that's around and about, that puts us into perspective on this tiny little speck that is the Earth.
And I think that's, where the story of the seventh movement, and so basically the synopsis, Hilary, is, and I've got this down to an elevator speech. The synopsis of this symphony is the first 6 moons is about the scientific data that's brought back through space probes. The 7th movement is about the emotional data brought back through the hearts of astronauts when they leave Earth's orbit and they have that perspective of looking back onto our planet, whether it's the Apollo missions or the International Space Station. There is this interconnectivity that is breathtaking, that is life-changing. And, with my many conversations with astronaut Nicole Stott and Helen Sharman from Imperial College, all astronauts come back failing words fail to try and describe that life-changing event. And I can't help but go to the adage, music takes over when words fail. And that was really my mission for the 7th moon, is to charge the atmosphere with reverence, awe, gratitude, and really position that 7th story as a point for Earthlings to have their own Earthrise without having to leave Earth's orbit, use the power, the persuasive, the manipulative forces of this universal language called music that we all can relate to, and we can all relate to our planet. It's our home. And that was really the big overarching themes of that 7th movement story.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for explaining all that. Can you just tell me how your lockdown was? Because I sense that with a lot of us, we're almost forgetting what it was like, where we were 2 years ago, and how life has changed, how it did change. So what was your lockdown like? I mean, bearing in mind that there were several different lockdowns, but
yes,
that whole kind of 2-year period.
Well, okay. So the first 10 months. Okay, here's my story. My husband would go out and do the shopping, and I would be glued to my studio every single day, like 12, 14 hours a day, because what I was doing is taking the electronic score that I created from a different platform and starting from ground zero and putting that in a notation software. I was using Dorico, and so it was a enormous task, billions of decisions I was making. Now, this is when lockdown happened, okay? So months rolled by, and my husband would be knowing that I was like pedal to the metal with all this, finessing of this orchestral score, ready for live musicians to finally perform. And he would come home and he'd be doing all the errands for me, because I was chained to my computer. Because at this point, Hilary, I had a target date at Abbey Road Studios for December 2020 with Marin Alsop conducting LSO and London Symphony Orchestra, etc. So I was literally racing the clock, and who was to know whether that would still go ahead? But I had to be ready. I had everything booked and deposits down, and so I was racing the clock. And my husband would come back from shopping. I'm like, right, okay, so are you in mask? He said, of course, because I wouldn't leave the house. Just in my little cocoon, just finishing this score, and I literally did not leave the house, it seemed. I mean, maybe once in a while, but so he was like my reality check of what was going on. So the first 10 months, it was like, what COVID? I was in my own little bubble. But then Marin Alsop and I stitched a plan to go and road test at least the orchestral parts in Vienna, and that's when I started to experience my COVID, which was having to navigate an aeroplane flight to Vienna. And that was looking pretty scary, because then it went zone red, Dubai, and I was just about to board the plane. They're like, you've got to get on, but we can't guarantee you're going to get let in the other side. I mean, that was a sort of hair raising. I was ringing my husband saying, okay, I think I'm just going to take the chance and go, because we set all this up, and fortunately they let me in. But I mean, that's, this is the amber zones, the red zones, or whatever those colors were. So I had my little frightful little moments there, and obviously clearly masked up. But anyway, but we managed to get a reading done, and that went super well. And then, of course, pretty much about a month later, I got the inevitable news that it wasn't going to happen at Abbey Road Studios. And so then I did, my next year was really actually, I found it as a blessing for me, because it gave me breathing space to just really calmly look at the project for what it is and what it was, and unpick the science and start really thinking about my outreach. And I was in a sea of words. I was in a sea of outreach words, figuring out how to repackage the story so that people could really get, I mean, you can enjoy the symphony for as it is, just music and visuals alone or whatever, or there's this massive undercurrent of information that's accessible if you want it. And that's what I really enjoyed for the second year of COVID, just calmly just enjoying all the revisiting of my science notes, and putting it as I want it to be experienced in a symphony.
Yeah, and it feels like it's all come together. And maybe without COVID, it would certainly have been different, and maybe it wouldn't have been the same, as good. So every once in a while somebody talks about something creative, something artistic that's happened that would not have happened if they'd been still getting on planes, flying everywhere, performing here, there, and everywhere. That it gave a lot of us a breathing space.
And absolutely, you just remind me of another massive project. Two things I want to comment on, actually. First of all, if we were going to have that session at Abbey Road Studios, I was really keen on having at least a piano reduction under my finessed ready. And I mean, this is like a 42-minute symphony, and there was no way that I would have had any bandwidth to do that. And I wanted to do that myself. I didn't want to start farming that out. So COVID gave me an incredible opportunity to enjoy that piano reduction process, and make those decisions about what just not it be such a rat race about quickly throwing it together. I could mindfully enjoy the scenery and the experience of just, okay, now this phase of the project, how lovely is it now? I can look at my orchestra and figure out how I'm going to make that piano reduction and the choir. And so I was doing that, and so I was dancing between that and the science, and it was just a really calm, tranquil platform. And I'm again, this whole project I've always wanted to enjoy every aspect about it, and COVID allowed that for me. So I'm really grateful for that time.
Yeah. Well, and I'm really grateful, because this podcast wouldn't exist without
I noticed
COVID.
that, actually, that yes, it came about during your COVID experience.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
It's amazing, and I am loving it. And it's become so much more now than just me sitting at home talking to people. And I've spoken to some incredibly talented musicians, because I've had the time, because people weren't dashing about here, there, and everywhere. And now I think, because I've got a bit of a reputation, people are prepared to give me the time when they are dashing around. So that's really amazing.
Exactly. Yes, I mean, for all the nastiness and the grief and sadness and frustrations, and boy, has it been a spiritual practice for so many of us to really step back and look at the bigger picture about time, and being expansive in that time, and eagle's perch, looking at the situation from a different perspective. And really, that's the theme of the seventh movement, loud and clear. And of course, now that we are reunited again, yet another theme that is driven home, that the point's really driven home in that seventh movement. So the timing of the birth of all of this was, for me, extraordinary, like in terms of the themes that this Moons Symphony truly represents.
Brilliant. So where can people, are there plans to perform this live?
I would love to say yes. At yet, no, there's no plans. And it's one of those really, I mean, the nice thing is like, I feel like, you know, being a musician sometimes isn't for the faint-hearted. You know, my sister pointed out to me, she's like, usually, Amanda, you know, people are like, oh, I've got to get a performance. And like, you're just so busy doing outreach and science, and you're like, you're just so relaxed about it. And I truly am. Like, if anything, this symphony has taught me, it has a life of its own. It has what I call the Moons Symphony clock. It does things when it wants to do. And I have enough evidence to prove that. So I'm just so perfectly relaxed and believe that when the timing's right, we'll get that world premiere somewhere on planet Earth. And I'm really not, I just very open and receptive to when that will happen. And I know that when it does happen, it's going to be absolutely brilliant. And so these things take time, and I don't necessarily want it to be rushed. I want it to be an extremely powerful event. It's going to require resources and financing, and that takes time. Sure. And so really, no, the answer to that is absolutely no, zero. I mean, and yet even before I composed the music, Hilary, I had already planned, the vision was a world premiere, maybe Royal Albert Hall, maybe Walt Disney Concert Hall. They're my two biggies. But I believe it's going to happen, and it will. And I'm, you know, and again, it's one of those things that enjoy the scenery as towards that next phase and how that all unfolds, really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for joining me. It was an absolute delight to talk to you.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed listening to that marvellous conversation with Amanda Lee Falkenberg. And what you're listening to now is Earth, Moon, Earthrise, the overview, which is the 7th movement of Amanda Lee Falkenberg's The Moons Symphony. Thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.